Well, as fighting in Ukraine intensifies, Russia's preparing to increase its troop mobilization and conscript more young men to fight on the front lines. The move could provoke a fresh wave of Russian refugees fleeing to avoid the fighting. But some Russians have found it difficult to attain refugee status.
Now he can breathe again. Stanislav Bashilov has finally been formally recognized as a refugee from Russia in Latvia. It was a long process. At the end of it, Stanislav is relieved to have cut ties with a country that started a war of aggression in the middle of Europe.
I fled to the first best country so I wouldn't have to go to jail or be sent to war. I don't want to fight against the Ukrainians. I have many friends there.
The first best country, as Stanislav said, was Latvia, an EU member state with a 300-kilometer common border with Russia. When the war started more than 10 months ago, Stanislav decided to protest. The former policeman found himself in the midst of a peace rally in St. Petersburg, where hundreds of protesters were arrested. When the 27-year-old received a draft notice from the army, he decided to flee overnight. Without losing any time, he drove to Russia's border with Latvia to jump over the fence at an unmonitored location, illegally, because he had no visa.
It was terrible. I was panicking. My heart was pounding. I was running through the forest and wondering, what if the guards shoot me? The fence was huge, with barbed wire, and on the other side there were border guards as well, whose language I don't understand. I had no idea how they would react.
The officials in Latvia were accommodating at first. They let him file for asylum. But a few months later, his request was denied. Stanislav went to court and fought the decision. In the end, he was allowed to stay. A rare ruling for Latvia. In contrast to Germany, the Baltic state generally denies Russians fleeing military service the right to stay. The mobilization in Russia, which began in September of last year, had little influence on that policy, due to security concerns.
If you are against the war, against mobilization, if you think that what is being done now is unacceptable, then you must come out against the Russian government. And I'm not convinced by arguments that things are so oppressive there that no one can take to the streets. Tens of thousands of Russians are leaving now, according to our figures. And the question must be asked, why should we accept them? This is also a matter of our own security.
Stanislav Bashilov doesn't think that taking to the streets in today's Russia can change anything. He says that there is no rule of law in Russia and also no reason to believe the regime is about to collapse either anytime soon. For him, protests are
the direct way to prison, and maybe after that to the front lines. All legitimate paths of resistance have been exhausted. People who protest end up behind bars, and from there they cannot achieve anything anymore.
Stanislav says he would go back to Russia one day when Putin is not in power anymore. His parents live there. Stanislav misses them, he says, but he knows he will not see them anytime soon.
Well, that report from our Moscow bureau chief, Yuri Resheta, who joins us now from Riga, where he's been based since authorities closed our offices in Russia last year. Welcome, Yuri. So tell us more about the difficulties for Russians who are escaping the war in Ukraine.
Well, Russians who are going to flee the war must first of all be allowed to leave Russia, Phil. There are professions in Russia that have been forbidden to travel abroad. Employees that are part of so-called critical crucial or critical infrastructure, some state-owned companies, members of the armed forces, then you have to be able to finance the trip. Flights to the Western countries have become very expensive because you have to fly via third countries because of the sanctions. What remains are neighboring countries, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Georgia, or the Baltic states. Georgia has long been one of the countries that hosted thousands of Russian citizens fleeing the war and especially mobilization, but the mood there seems to be changing towards Russian citizens. It's getting more and more negative.
Right, so authorities there in Riga generally opposed to most Russians who are trying to get there and become refugees.
Well, I have to stress that the Baltic countries, of course, have not closed their borders to all Russian citizens. As before, they let Russians in who are really threatened. People who criticized publicly the Putin system in Russia, for example, independent journalists, political activists and their family members. These are all people who can get protection for so-called humanitarian reasons. But at the same time, for the authorities here, simply fleeing mobilization isn't a reason to apply for asylum. They argue that while these Russians feel their personal lives are in danger, but they may still be sympathetic toward the Kremlin. So there are major security concerns here.
Yuri, is this war popular in Russia?
Well, it's really hard to say how strong the support for Putin's policies or the war is, because many people no longer dare even to talk about politics in the subway because they are afraid of simply being denounced. A few weeks ago, an elderly woman was thrown off a bus for making critical remark about the Russian army. A video that showed this incident circulated on social media. Let's have a look at a poll from Moscow made by our colleagues. The question that was asked was, what has changed in your life since the start of the so-called special military operation, as this war is called in Russia?
It's bad. It's bad for everyone. We should not be fighting. We should live in peace.
I've got 2 sons. I worry about them. The situation won't get better unless the war ends.
How can you force someone to fight and kill? It's against the Bible.
Life has changed for the better. We'd want this war to be stopped. I hope all these young 18-year-old children will get back home safe and sound. All is good with us, but we worry about our soldiers.
It's up to the authorities to decide. I don't want to interfere in this.
So far, it hasn't affected the area where I live. I don't know what's next. The only thing that did happen, many men were taken to the front.
I support the operation.
There are no rallies. Everyone here supports it. We've sent humanitarian supplies.
That's what people in Moscow say. Some of them still support Putin, as we just heard, even though there is great fear of a next mobilization wave. By the way, the Russian government announced that the draft age is to be raised soon from 27 to 30 years old. Russia needs people on the front line.
Thanks for that, Yuri. Yuri Reshetto in Riga.